Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we discuss literature, culture, and history in this snowy land that we call Canada. Today, we have a very special guest. He is a founding member and three-time president of the Manitoba Writers Guild, a founding editor with Turnstone Press, and professor at St. John's College at the University of Manitoba. Our guest has lived his creative life on the prairies, where he has been a poet, publisher, teacher, critic, theorist, anthologist, reviewer, organizer, and mentor. I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Dennis Cooley to the show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
You're here actually to talk about your latest poetic work, right? Body Works, in this case, which is set to be published this year or has been published. I get dates mixed up in my mind. And as an opening question in this case, would you like to describe your book for people who might have no awareness of it? And if you want to do so with a poetry reading, by all means.
Okay. Well, I briefly would say this, that I've got a comical and sympathetic treatment of the body, which figures as a vulnerable and hopeful thing. So that runs in one way or another across the text. It also becomes at times a tender and gentle treatment of the body, but much of it is comical. Comical, I think, in a double sense. Comical in the usual use of that word, as in laughable and funny, ha. At least I think it is and hope it is much of the time. But I think comic also in the kind of generic sense of the comedy of almost in a Phrygian way, Northrop Frye talking about the comedy, which brings us from division and discontent and deterioration, whatever, to resolution and recompense. The problems are brought to some kind of reasonably happy reconciliation. That may not be quite accurate, I got, but that's kind of comedy I think I'm after. But I want to read from the book a poem called But the Body. It comes, as a number of these pieces come, from travels. I keep journals sometimes in travels, and I'm able to plumb these journals to find some material for my work. This comes from one time when I was teaching Canadian literature in Germany many years ago. And it's pretty straightforward, I think, a comical narrative poem about the body. Happy to be body, the body one sunny day gives itself up, stands up from the computer where it was made to sweat and stiffen next to the window. Hey, body, come on, body, let's go. Come on, boy. Body perks, promises air and motion. The body stops to get a smell. Come on, boy, let's go. Needn't worry, needn't worry. The body follows the leash of his love. They are buddies now, creatures of their wald, the green and worldly world. Snuff, snuff. The poet and his body go deeper and deeper, further and further. Body talking to itself, talking itself out of its snit. It does not fear ticks, the body. Its cold nose sidesteps the little steaming piles that other dogs have dumped in relief and greeting. They wend their way into the warty forest. The German trees, gummy and roused, are wading down the shaded paths, rustle, rustle, leaning toward them. They want to get the poet alone where they can spray him in the face. He belches poisonous gases, which the trees, grown trembly, inhale in long, deep gasps. They sway in delirium, but the body, let out, it will not let down the poet, takes him down, yes, to the tennis courts. The body longs to bounce on the balls of its stupid feet. Body thinks it is still young, wonders if the poet still loves it. It huffs and makes whimpery sounds, imagines it too could be whacking balls all over the place. Body thinks it could make a run for it. It should fling itself with a rattle against the chainmail fence, where it can cling like a bill collector or a disappointed soccer fan. So that is fairly typical, I think, of the pieces, and there are at least a clutch of them that are personal and highly oral and narrative, and treats the body, as I want to believe, tenderly, but also laughingly.
Absolutely. And I like that connection that you make to Northrop Frye in this case. and his idea of comedy, which I haven't read Fry in a while, I have to admit. But if I remember correctly, one of the major elements of comedy for Fry is the idea of union, right? That comes up. And I feel like that's also a central part of your work, not only in the poem that you just read, but in the body works collection as a whole, right? This idea of union and disunion comes up, I feel, both as an underlying and very prevalent and theme, I guess. Am I correct in saying that? Or
Oh, I certainly think so. And
Mhm.
I'm happy you said that because uh, I'm surprised sometimes when readers uh, wonder what a particular piece is doing in a book, and the connections to me seem strong and evident. But of course, it they ought to be, I guess, because I dropped them there out of some sense that they're part of that collection. So I know that the books, this one, I suppose, too, in various ways, kind of test readers to see how they might piece things together and position them, relate the parts. But that sense of interrelatedness is really strongly there for me. I know one thing that you had been wondering about was what connection, if any, there may be with the concern for the body and the concern for planets or cosmic forces. And
Mhm.
I thought, well, it's perfectly obvious, isn't it, that the interrelatedness of the whole of all parts of that world that runs through what arguably would be, I guess, an ecological vision, uh, but an evolutionary one as well. Was a powerful narrative for me. When I was an undergraduate, I minored in biology, uh, and not much of it has stuck with me. All the technical details are long gone, but what powerfully remains for is a sense of interconnectedness of life and the development of species and evolution and how that continues into our bodies and past those into the future. So I write pretty strongly about this. You may recall the poem called "Where We Unravel." Yeah, page 47, and it is in some ways a minor part of this text that is not quite as common in its style as others, but it is there, and it picks up pretty clearly that story of evolution. So here it is: 5 million years, a stumble of stars, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, a flesh hold on life, the clack of pilt down Australopithecus, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, peaking in us, travel and claim the disarticulated bones. Your bones, my father, do not fall into meadows of light, nor water more supple than skin. The Estevan city cemetery, the sound clay and gravel make, the scrape of concrete. Posture is normally upright, the bright blood broken. Full fathom 5, thy father lies, nebulae and carbon. So modern member of our species is continues all those previous members of the species. The and as a reader of Fry, you probably recognize the line "full fathom 5, the father lies." But beyond that, of course, yeah, that's a wonderful passage, isn't it, from Shakespeare? These
Absolutely.
pearls were his eyes.
And
That
this is something that, you see, since you brought up the idea of connecting to planet in this case, I might as well keep going on this.
yeah.
I said, yeah, I'm curious because these are such physical, attributes in a sense, right? The planet is, as you were mentioning, a biological, we call it a biome in some ways, or something ecological, and the body is obviously something that's physical in some senses. And I'm curious what your thought process is for actually using poetry to perhaps explore that, right? This poetry, yes, there's a materiality to it in a sense, but it is also very emotional and intangible in many ways, right? You're invoking sentiments with poetry in some ways. This is obviously putting it rather simply, but how do you see poetry bridging that gap between body and planet and these physical aspects?
Uh, wonderful. Well, maybe I can take that just in a little different way.
For sure.
That the writing that I've been doing for a long time, I think, uh, wobbles between a fairly contemporary sense of language and formal possibility and a very strong personal sense of emotion. Uh, and often in the same text. I mean, here is a poem just now that works off some very primary scientific knowledge, I guess, and a very personal narrative that becomes part of that tucked into it. And one part would seem to be in a kind of vaguely scholarly manner almost, and the other in that commitment to almost a private emotion. So I juggle those things all the time, and I like them. One of the consequences is I tend to get two different responses of dissatisfaction. People who are involved in a pretty determined way with contemporary notions of linguistics and form will say that these are sentimental or lyrical, and that's a weakness in them. And folks who are more interested in lyrical poetry will say, well, will tend to think that these are too scholarly or too academic or whatever. I myself love the play between them. But what I do not like about some of the savvy writing we have these days is long, abstract, analytical prose dropped into poetry. I find that writing kind of deadly and clogging in a poem. Write those in an essay, though sometimes I don't much like them in essays either, when I think the prose sometimes gets really heavy and turgid and obstructionist. But I like that range, though, of what you can and do, what you do and can draw on when you write. That plays the kind of edges as I move strongly also between the pull of an eye and an ear. That the using the page for visual effect, which I've always liked. The page is there, and you've got all this open space, and you can sprinkle and wedge ink on it in all kinds of ways. So that's a moving, obviously, toward graphic art. On the other side, one side, and the other side, you move toward music as the voices and voicings get stronger and stronger, or featured, or become multiple. Something that I've always liked, the speaking oral voice. So the range are there, and they're everything betwixt and between almost. I sometimes describe myself when someone seeks such a term, say I'm a mongrel poet. That I utterly impure, and I'll use all sorts of things that would seem to be illicit or improper from one point of view or another, but I have the sense that there are all those resources. Why forgo them? And as I say, one of the consequences is those poets in particular who have committed themselves to a certain kind of poetics might not be very happy. But I'm irregular and unfaithful. I'm drawn by the sirens of many sorts.
And kind of relating this back to this idea, right, more concretely, of the body and planet, right, that we were bringing up, is people like to think that these are very, what's the word I'm looking for, structured in many ways, right? That there's a balance to all of this, but the more you look into the dynamics of the planet, and the more it's there's so many chaotic elements to it. And I really like this term that you brought up of like mongrel poetry. And I like, people that I've read have not necessarily used this term when in referencing the planet or the body, but I feel like that can also apply in many ways, right? This kind of amalgamation or this odd collage work that is the planet. And I feel like that's another way that your poetry can perhaps reflect that, right? In the body as well.
Yes. The book, I think, again and again, comes to a sense that the world rolls through the rest of the world in various parts in interchange back and forth. But the major metaphor I use for this is atomic, really. Here's this poem called "For the Time Being" on page 6. They blunder into us and they make us their own particulars, their known familiars, perilously unaffiliated and in no way benign, when it's over fooling us into believing Once upon a time, we were the one and only one. They will have their way. They always leave. They want to break up, run off with something or other, disassemblingly making up another story. Pure alchemy. Being unconscionably fickle, they're off for some bit of fluff that's not us, and that's it. That's it for us. We are history. We are goners, our hopes of sticking together dashed. The whole affair completely mortifying. They have their fun, their little fling. They have their way with us, our rank and trembling desires. So that's runs a whole lot. I keep mentioning this because it's such an important book for me. Bill Bryson, whom the world knows as a funny writer of travel books, wrote several big, serious, amazing books. One of them was called The Origins of Almost Everything. And I'd drawn on that many, many times, including that conceit, actually, I got from him, the notion of that material world with uh, its assembling, disassembling quickly as an act of betrayal and romance. So that's his notion and the knowledge from him. But I love that, and I loved it so much I had to be careful that I didn't simply take his text and plunk it in there. But it is his work that's behind that.
Sure. You could always say it's found poetry in that case. It's fine.
Oh, I've got a found poem in here.
Yeah.
This one's called Ms. Lonely Hearts. It's on page 139. Ms. Lonely Hearts. This is a reference and a title, I guess, that may not exist for younger readers, but maybe perhaps not. It will become apparent in any case, I think, from the poem. Has the heart you treat as a motor sprung a leak? Is it dripping oil? Better fix it today before it is too late. Do not ignore it or hope it repairs itself. Be proactive. Left unchecked, it can get on hoses or seals and cause them to degrade prematurely. Leaking oil can create ugly smudges. Your engine could suddenly seize up or burst into flame. You should not feel disheartened. It is crucial to stop the leaks. That should be your number one priority. For starters, have a peek under the hood. You should keep a close eye on the dipstick. If the level drops, you are losing oil when blue smoke pours out. Check for signs of stains or a puddle, especially after it has been sitting. Overnight, crawl under and check the oil pan. You are looking for gaskets that have failed. Be sure that the plug is tight and the bolts in the pan are snug. A little care for your own condition, and by morning you will be back in circulation and singing like a top. So mostly thought I doctored it a little bit as I would be evident, I think, to a reader. But I was on the lookout. Characteristic strategy on my part. I open terrain when I'm working at a book. What kind of interest have I got here? Okay, in this case, the body. So how might you conceive of the body? What are the possibilities? So I'm in search often for more tropes. So how can you locate this? Name it in other ways. And I did, in fact, read this ad for care of maintenance of a car. And I've taken essentially that text, slightly altered, to turn this into a poem of a stricken heart, advice from for the lovelorn. But that's always the strategy. What else can I say? That's been the case for all the other books I think that I've done. But this is the one we're speaking to here.
And just picking up on that, if I can, I'm curious. This is one of the questions that I had, but it's a good place, I think, to plug it. Is you know, how do you plan something like this? Because there is obviously, as we've been talking to, a thematic through line through this, but do you know ahead of time what exactly you're going to touch upon it as kind of sub themes, if you will? Or is it mostly based on, okay, well, I wrote this and this inspired me to talk about something else? Or as you're saying, just seeing an ad, did you see the ad as you were writing, or did the ad come before and then you kind of kept workshopping this idea and wrote it all in one go? How does that whole process work for you?
Well, in this case, there were actually at least two very specific events in my life that got me going in this book. That I look like a pretty healthy guy, and am, but I've had a series of medical traumas that set off the interest. I was diagnosed many years ago with arthritis, uh, and so I wrote out of that. I wrote a whole bunch of bone poems and lame poems and limping poems or whatever, and problems poems with articulation, disarticulation, bone parts, foot parts, mostly facetious. But then, years after that, I had a valve replacement in my heart, so I wrote a whole bunch of heart poems. And again, most of them are comical and facetious. So those things are going as groups. Okay, I'm writing bone poems. I'm writing heart poems, but I also had been over the years writing poems out of crazy little quirks and passions and little leads here and there. So I always have stashes and stashes and stashes of poems of various kinds that may be unassigned or undesignated in any number of ways. And I have those there to plumb, and also endless notes. I keep huge piles of notes that proliferate, and as a storehouse. Here's something that may be of some use or will help me remember. I write, if I don't write the notes down, I forget almost all of them. Uh, so I scribble them down and then type them into this massive compilation that gets bigger and bigger. But back to your question, this book started from those two traumas. And then I built up, back, and around from that, saying, what else have I got uh, in in draft form or in relatively finished form or notes or whatever that I can assemble? But what new things can I do? So the particular found poem was found well into the writing of the manuscript. But your question, I think, points to what happens often. Yeah, uh, they're there ahead of time and they find a new home. I move things constantly from one text to another, one book to another, and I constantly revise them. So there's just an enormous stash of things interplay, and I lose track of them constantly. They move. They're very motile. But
Yeah.
I don't believe in what sometimes people used to call, maybe still do, organic form. Uh,
Mm.
that is, I don't think of the poem as something that grows of its own impetus, or not for me, of its own impetus and its inevitable development and ending. Uh, that I rate in process all the time. What can be done? How can this be changed? What else occurs to me? What can I find on the internet? Constantly checking, researching, uh, but I revise like crazy. I almost never do I whack off a poem and say there it is. And in fact, I can think of about two in my life, which that was the case. And interesting enough, they were once one poem that I wrote the night my mother died, and one part was about my father, and one about my mother, and I did it, wrote those in about half an hour, and hardly ever changed a word. And I think the poem in particular is one of my best poems ever. But anyway, it's not organic for me. Form. It's mobile. It moves. It's mobile. It's constant into revision and redirection and abandonment. Uh, but that involves strategies of intervention or accidents of intervention, not always intended or planned. In fact, often not, but are found. I believe enormously in accident and happy happenstance. Uh, you get something off a rhyme or a mistake, even.
Absolutely agree with that. It's, I do write some poetry in my spare time. I don't do it professionally at all, but I can definitely get to that sense, right, of what you're talking about where, yeah, sorry, go ahead. You look like
I'm
you
just
want to say
yeah,
something.
my response is not, it's not scolding or mocking, but of agreement and pleasure. Saying yes, that I believe that anybody who reads poetry really carefully is very close to writing it. The reading, a good reading is very close to the writing. The skills, the attention, the care, the knowledge are very, very close to being the same thing. So I my pencil wagging was when happiness and approval.
No, but I was just going to agree with you in the sense of, often I'll be reading something for school or for pleasure, and there's this idea that'll come to my mind, and I'll kind of write down whatever ideas I have in that moment in some vaguely poetic form. And I have a specific document that I have for like poems in process, right? And it's kind of funny. It's like it's a collection of in process poems, if you will, which I don't know if you can call like a formal collection in any kind of sense, but it's these constant reworkings that I have on the go, and I can totally understand what you're talking about in this case. And yeah, some of them, I guess, are something. I don't know. I firmly believe that any literary work or any artwork can always be worked on in a sense, right? There's very few things that are ever fully finished as far as artwork is concerned.
Yeah, yeah. The well, I would agree with you on this one as well. I I remember at a recent launch, someone asking, "How do I know when a poem is finished?" And I said, I don't. Uh, that and I quoted as I've taken to quoting. The name will vary now depending on who's reporting this. So this quotation is attributed to Auden. It's attributed to Mallarmé, and there are probably 3 or 4 other names that are given credit for this. But here's the quotation: "A poem is never finished; it's only abandoned." Uh,
Mm.
when I first heard that, I was offended. I was a young undergraduate. I thought this is a sign of laziness and slovenliness. But it seems to me wise over the years of writing. You're never, what would a finished poem be? Uh, and why would you want one? Uh,
Mm.
the so I would say you make it the best you can, and sometime or other you're going to have to release it. How could you ever be satisfied saying that's it? It could not be improved. The At the same time, I keep changing, revising, and I start thinking then, okay, now have I made it better or just changed it, or have I weakened it? Because my impulse, once I get something going, is to expand it. Say, where can I take this? Where might it go? What else? What more? Uh, uh, and they tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then the strain for me often is saying, okay, bring this back because this is just going to bore everybody, and it's losing power, right? It's just getting clogged up. Uh, the So in most immediate instance of that experience comes happily from this book, Body Works, in which for which the editor Helen did a wonderful job of nudging me very gently and good humoredly and wisely into cutting back some stuff, saying, forego that, make this shorter. And several of the poems were, I think, enormously improved by doing that. I read you one. And here's an instance of one. This one's called Backgammon. I wrote a series of poems looking for possibilities, parts of the body. I have backs, we have hands, I have feet. Uh, so, well, what about the back? So I got on my internet and started looking up idioms for back, right? And I found several hundred, and I wrote a poem with probably about 102 of these. Uh, and Helen said, maybe you want to make it a little shorter. So I did, and here's what I've got. Uh, I think it's a much better poem for in its effect, but I also lament all the wonderful things I once had that are now gone. How do you forgo things when you find them shining and bright? Anyway, backgammon. It's all coming back to me. Back when life was good. Get back that loving feeling. We go a long way back, as far back as you can remember. Looking back, I might have done things differently, but now we're back. We're right back where we started. You can't hold back the rain. You can't hold back the sunrise. You can't hold back the wind. You are back where you belong, blinking back the tears. You have bounced back in the game. Sit back and enjoy it. Back in my arms. Sit back and relax. You're back home again, back home where you belong. I always knew you'd come back. You always come back. Well, as I was writing that, I was thinking of the theater of the absurd, right? Where you get that uh, kind of crazy, almost neurotic, psychic, where the expressions, repetitions and variations on them around situations that are often um, poignant. I think some of those figures in the theater of absurd, a kind of poetry of hesitation or uncertainty, of yearning, sense of missing or wanting something. So I kind of like the effect of piecing those things together that way, though I'm forever using idiom or poetic effect.
Absolutely. And I particularly like that middle passage in this case. You say, you can't hold back the rain, you can't hold back the sunrise, you can't hold back the wind. You are back where you belong, blinking back the tears. I think that one really, when I read that one, that's top tier poetry right there. I really enjoyed that one. And hearing you explain it, or at least the context behind it, is all the more interesting. And I feel like it links to another question that I had. And in preparation for this discussion, I listened to another interview that you did a few years ago with writer Jonathan Ball, and you mentioned in that interview that part of the process of writing for you is one that exposes and explodes contradictions, right? As you, and I'm quoting from you here, as you mine a topic in a particular way. And I think that the idea of mining is particularly worth spending time on in this case, or at least in the idea of contradictions, especially when we're talking about bodies. And I'm curious, like, how you see that working in this particular work. And I think already in backgammon, you already see those contradictions emerging a little bit. But I was wondering if you had a little bit more to say about that whole process that you mentioned.
Yeah, there's a poem here called the Relic, which is fairly long, so it may uh, not be wise to read the whole thing just now. This came from a news report. CBC in Winnipeg reported that there was going to be a featuring of a hand from a saint in Rome, a hand that was from several centuries ago. And the CBC announcer was really excited about this and told us that a student would be bringing his hand, flying this hand to Winnipeg uh, for the show. So we've got a relic, right? That's going to be a sacred object and will be there for people to venerate and to benefit the proximity to. And I forgive me, but I thought of comical possibilities out of this off the top. And I wrote a long poem working out all kinds of variations on hand and handing, right? Here's the hand. But I also, as I was working this and then doing more research, I realized that, I mean, this is this hand, in fact, had a history of benevolence and intimacy and tenderness with people, and this is very important for many people. So I reworked the poem with that in mind, so that I didn't want this simply to be disrespectful or mean, but to see the hand in several ways. But what do you think? This is a fairly long read here. You
A few
go at it, you can
stanzas, I
cut it
think
out.
we'll do it.
Yeah, you can cut it out if it doesn't work, eh?
Sure.
Okay.
And you're the way you read your poetry, I feel, is very relaxing and soothing in many ways. So I'm really enjoying that.
Okay, good. All right, here we go. The relic. This is, by the way, spelled Relique to create the greater sense of antiquity and a special quality. The man in the radio said he would give his right arm to look it in the eye. They could see the time was at hand, and so they played the hand they were dealt. It was a hands-on operation all the way, even for those who dragged their feet. It was no sleight of hand. There was more to it than meets the eye when the tour got off on a solid footing. The student had everything in hand and hadn't the heart to turn her back on anyone, not even the backsliders. People were feeling a little down at the heels, but the student was hoping the hand would be a shot in the arm once they set foot in the room. Even so, some wondered, would the left hand know what the right was doing? Everyone knew the arm which had left Rome only a handful of times and had kept an arm's distance, soon would be so close at hand you could but should not hold or even touch it, hands off for you. If you got close, you could be a relic. and good standing too, fourth class quite probably. You would be near the steady hand that had shook the hand of St. Ignatius, that had reached out and touched other hands warmly, a lifeline you could feel in your heart. The student from Ottawa had to watch her step. She kept it at hand in her carry-on and feared it stood out like a sore thumb where it sat. On the seat, the student didn't want the arm to get off on the wrong foot before she flew it back on the end of her wrist. Organizers did not want to get caught flat-footed, and were glad to find no one raised a hand, certainly not the hand full of skeptics who hadn't a leg to stand on, who for sure didn't want to go to hell. In a handbasket they would feel like heels. Their doubts didn't amount to a slap on the wrist. That is why they stuck their necks out. They pulled it off, everyone said. It was a hands-down success. You got to hand it to them. It was a miracle, people agreed, how well things were handled. It showed the perfect touch. So more hands, more feet. The poem called The Foot, I had originally called The Lightfoot. Uh, some, I know some will, in fact, know that phrase from a poem by Robert Duncan, The Lightfoot hears you and the dance begins. But the poem is so facetious, I didn't want the echo particularly, so I just changed it to the foot. But anyway, there you get the parts of the bones of the foot and all kinds of crazy riffs running, playing off those bits. And part of the search for options, alternatives. How might you think of the foot?
No, I was just going to say, and bringing it back to, the idea of the poem you just read, The Relic. I do find it interesting because I was wondering why you had spelt it differently in the title, because I read it in French automatically, De Relique, right?
Yeah,
Because that's how you say it
yeah,
in French, or
yeah.
spell it in French, I should say. But the way that you explain it as a kind of historical move, right, or at least a move to the past, I feel is very interesting and does tie into the broader theme of this particular question that we're exploring of mining, right? Of mining through history and exploring how certain ideas and certain concepts like the body or language can be, manipulated throughout, time, and how our understanding in this particular present moment, right, does change this relic, right? If you want to think of it that way. And I feel like that's particularly, it offers a new insight, I think, into that poem that I thought that was very appreciated. I just wanted to mention that before we moved too far past that particular work.
Yeah, not all, speaking of time, that first section of the book, which I think is called For the Time Being, was it Time for the Time Being? Uh,
Yep, yep,
uh,
exactly.
that was one of the last things I did. Saying,
Oh,
what?
interesting.
So I'm situated here, and I wrote some of those things fairly quickly.
Mm.
But I suspect for a lot of readers that part section of the poem will be, the book will be the most popular. Uh, the
Oh,
well, they tend to be quieter, and the language is very simple and brief, and there's a kind of meditative quality there that it's as much as I could suppose any of these things claim to any wisdom. There's maybe a kind of quality of kind of wisdom poetry in some of them. I'm after a different one.
well,
I know.
I can have a suggestion for you. I think this there's one that I mentioned in my own notes. In this case, Pennywise, I feel also fits within this idea. Perhaps you have a different opinion of that, but I feel like that can also work within what you're talking about. It's in the body politic. It's not in For the Time Being, but I still think it works in the idea that we're going for.
Okay, Pennywise. This poem, in its origins, is an anomaly here. This is a spillover from a book that I wrote many years ago called Bloody Jack. That was I think 1984 or something like that when the book came out. And I invented a romantic figure for the main character, Bloody Jack Kravchenko. I invented a romantic figure called Penny, and this is echoing that in some ways and came from that. This is not the original form, but it came from there. So Pennywise, the man they hung according to the paper, the Peters and the Poppers folded like an accordion when he held up the bank in Plum Cooley, and the manager closed around the hole in his belief. It was spring, he was sprung, the earth flung loose from penury, the banks and God's purpose overflowing with savings accounts, the world the spill with April and an apricot sun. It was a terrible blow to safekeeping the trust in legal tender. He had smashed his leg accidentally when he fell, escaping the doctor, who incidentally worried when he said he would never walk again, when all he had intended was for Penny Mint to be sitting pretty to send good news. The leg so well and tenderly mended, the doctor thought to have saved him when he would up to the walk on the way, when he would be up to the walk all the way on his own, all the way to the ozone, to the letters he would poke his head into, and they would throw the lasso around him, accidentally on purpose. In the end, once they got the hang of it, a priority to draw him blithely 4 sheets to the wind. Time was up, they said, and deliberately hung him, like Billy Budd, like a Union Jack.
Yeah, this at least this poem particularly speaks to me in what we're kind of talking about, and I'm thinking you mentioned earlier the I organ in this case. This was a few minutes ago, but I feel like a lot of your poems, including this one, works on this very interesting duality or contradiction between the I organ and I pronoun person. And I feel like this is something that's interesting to explore in the context of the body, right? As a kind of poetic form, or even as a poetic genre in this case, right? The I contradiction that finds form, so to speak, poetically and bodily, that I feel is prevalent in the work that you've been reading. Am I onto something in this case? I don't know. I'm workshopping that idea.
I'm sure you are. I'm a believer that readers make their own poems.
Mm.
That uh, no, I don't particularly believe that anything anybody says is perfectly fine or credible or satisfactory. Is what you know. So it's not a matter that it's good because I said it, or but it's credible given that text. That's an interesting response. I can see where you would respond that way. So yeah, but certainly the I runs through many of these things, and also the that an I runs through some of the poems, but I think not in this text particularly.
Mm.
But one of the things that intrigues me here is that this is based on historical fact as well for that figure. This guy Kravchenko was a notorious Robin Hood figure who lived in Manitoba just before the First World War, who was ended up being hanged for accidentally killing a guy during a bank robbery. But I mean, one of the ironies is uh, there was a entertaining escape on his part. He escaped, evaded the police for quite a long time. Eventually was found out and jailed, escaped once again, and severely damaged his leg when he fell from a rope as he was climbing out of an upper story jail cell. So the doctor treated him for his injuries. They were concerned that he might be able to whether he could walk to the gallows. They had to get him in good health so they could kill him. They said, "Oh my God!" So the body endangered, and violence done to bodies in the name of therapy and health, or alongside that. I mean, the doctor, I've no doubt, was perfectly ethical and concerned, but then he hands him over to these guys who go and kill him. So again, I'm just thinking of how is the body positioned? I mean, our culture has been so rooted in its highest aspirations, it seems, in philosophy to what is fixed and true and immutable. But the body exists in the perishable and vulnerable world. What reverence and respect for the body when it is irrelevant or immaterial? I've got a long passage on material. That's immaterial. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What is matter? Matter matters is, I guess, could be a motto for the poem. Matter matters. Yeah.
Getting into some heavy concepts in this case. I know there's a whole sub branch of academia that deals with exactly that phrase, and what is it called? New materialism in this case, that just talks about how matter matters. And I really think that's interesting, of considering the subjectivities of things that we thought were objectively, to bring back a conversation we had before recording, objectively inanimate, right? And adding subjectivities to things like this, and is, I think, an important move that we need to make, both philosophically and through literature and culture. And I think that's one of the things that your work does rather interestingly in this case.
The body becomes a powerful character too. For example, at night, Cooley listens. The Cooley character finds himself bedraggled and worn as he comes home hungover. The body launches a complaint about how it's been abused and mistreated. So there's a kind of debate in Cooley abusing his own body, and the body arguing for justice and fair treatment.
Yeah. I was just going to say, the other questions that I have for you in this case do relate in a more general sense, right? Less a particular sense to the individual poems, but more to a general sense of how this particular work fits within a wider idea or scope or history of Canadian literature. But I was wondering, before we moved into kind of like this second half, I was wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to mention, or any other particular reading that you wanted to do before we kind of transitioned into more of that general type of questions.
I'm arguing, as you know, tried to argue that this book includes sense of tenderness in its treatment of the body of human life. Here's one called "Traveling Light," page 17. It picks up an old Greek myth that we all know. The figures, a man and a wife. Wife is in one of the stories bitten by a snake, taken to the underworld by the god of the underworld. The stricken husband, search of his wife, goes in search of her, loses her when they're returning to Earth, because he looks back when he wasn't supposed to, right? So that's behind this text, but more as the beginning than an essential part. Traveling light, reaching out to touch his wife. She wasn't there the time he yanked through his sleeve the scarf that he dropped on the way back. The bodies we hold in casual delinquency as a matter of light occupancy, as if time did not go all the way through, as if we were not fireflies in a jar or the breath of gravity. The matter of light occupancy I kind of like as a picking up that sense of the physical conditions, the situation, the attitude toward bodily life. This is maybe of little consequence, but of course it would be at the heart of a reality. It's an occupancy of light that passes through us and embodies and drives us. So I thought it kind of nicely distilled the sense of loss and emotional anguish, but also something about the impermanence of life and the materiality that we share with life, as if we were not fireflies in a jar or the breath of gravity. Traveling light.
Well, I'm curious, actually. This is not a planned question, but I'm curious because you provide context for some of these poems, right? Adding on through Fry, or expressing like a line from Robert Duncan and so on, or the Greek myth behind this particular poem. And I'm curious if you, like, how you actively think about, or if at all, right, the way that your readers will engage with this particular poem without necessarily having that context. Or do you just assume that people might have some level of context, or is it perhaps not necessary?
Well, you got readers at all kinds of stages of attention or energy and readiness or preparedness, right? If I hear reading a poem at a reading, I will notice a lot less than if I reread it or hear it a second time, or whatever. So I mean, a lot of it's just not available for want of energy or time, not simply knowledge or information, but of just having the physical capacity of energy and alertness or whatever to pick things up. But I think that's the nature of literary writing anyway. I'm about to say encoded might not be the best word. Things in your poem all the time, poetry all the time. One of my disappointments, actually, to pick up the gist of your concern, is that a lot of what you do, nobody seems to know.
Mm.
But I think it's almost inevitable that a lot of things are not going to get picked up, especially in just on a first exposure, often just a quick one. Somebody zips through a text. Literary reading is an act of enormous patience, and our culture is impatient and wants processing should be fast. Speed reading is the way because it's just information that you're imparting, right? And you can get that quickly. No, mostly you're not getting information in poetry. You might get some, but that's not the contract, and it's tough for your writer to say you're on the wrong contract here. Hang in there a little bit. This is I like to believe I'm offering you a lot, but I also want to believe I'm challenging you a lot. But I write these things in such a way that I think many of them are accessible very quickly and easily. Saying, okay, at some point, and so much so that, especially in the narrative comical ones, a reader might be, or listener may attempt to say, okay, I've got it, and not realize, hey, there may be a whole lot other possibilities there. That one of the things is lots of people haven't read the earlier literature much at all, and
Sure.
nowadays hardly anybody has read the Bible. And I work biblical stuff as many writers do right into the writing. There is all that tradition with incredible uh, force of that language and what it's where it's been and what it's done,
Mm.
and that's often unheard. But at the same time, you work them in sneakily. That that I mean, I suppose it'd be something you said. Even put an epigraph in from a Greek poet. I mean, I'm prepared. In
Mm.
fact, do things like that sometimes. Uh, I had a bunch of great epigraphs ready for this book, uh, and I took them all out
Oh.
because, well, yeah, well, here's the deal. The editor said, well, you got to get permission for all these things. Uh,
Mm.
Saying, well, I understand that, but when they're this big, you shouldn't have to, right? And
Right.
it's a kind of wobbly conditions now, right? When are you fairly acknowledging and borrowing, and when are you just stealing? So I respect both of these positions, but it seems to me little guys ought to come acknowledged, but without some kind of elaborate legal and formal permission hunting. So I just didn't have the heart to do that. But I had some great quotations. One of them is somebody saying that body's a strange thing. We maybe you don't possess it quite as much as we suppose, nor realize quite how much it possesses us, or something like that. But a much
Mm.
more eloquent passage. And a lovely passage from Auden, that famous poem, that love poem, "Lay your head upon my
Oh.
shoulder." That is yeah, and a lovely passage from Wordsworth saying, "This is it. This is our world. This is our world here."
Are you talking about Lullaby by Auden by any chance?
Yes, yeah. So
Okay.
I had kind of tightened up a few lines, took a few out, and had a few. So I had about 6 lines in total,
Yeah.
but it would have fit the text so beautifully. But
And like, who
uh,
do you even ask for permission for Auden? I guess is literary executors at that point, but like,
I know this
who do
is
you
part of the
ask?
obstacle. I discouraging me saying, "Oh, I didn't have the heart to even try this." It might have been very simple, but I just felt disheartened. You know,
No, I get it. Yeah. And although I do appreciate this little peek behind the scene of what could have been as far as this poetry
yeah,
collection was concerned.
yeah. Well, they echo so
Um,
beautifully, don't they? The epigraph is just such a
yeah,
resonant thing.
absolutely. Shifting a little bit into more of a general question in this case, because I figured if I have Dennis Cooley on the show, I'm going to ask him questions about his career and other things. And your work has often been associated with the long poem genre, right? It was a major part of your early career, especially, and even later. And body works, I guess, arguably could fit somewhat into that genre, but not really. And I'm curious how you would qualify this particular work. If not a long poem, then is it something else, right? Or something different that you're playing with, because it is obviously connected to itself like a long poem, but each poem is individual in its own right? So how would you categorize that, if such a thing is what you were looking for?
Years ago, George Bowring and a few other people were talking about something they called a serial poem. And
Mm,
by that, they meant a poem that was long, or at least a collection that was long, but it contained poems related uh, uh, by some principle or other. One of the principles that, as I recall, that both he and Frank Davy tried was to write the poem off the turning of the tarot card. You turn up a card, you write the poem, you do another one. Uh, so you have a series of poems that are interrelated on some principle or other. There, the principle would be pretty obvious. The turning of the card, the writing of the poem. Uh, so I would maybe inclined to call this thing a serial poem. I never worry too much about how one names these things. For example, uh, in almost any book I've written that I call poetry, people could happily and convincingly say, there are 8 pieces here that aren't poems at all. Uh,
yeah,
the uh, I think of them as poems, or at least as participating in poetic act, as they rub against and create friction among and warmth between these sections, other sections, and I love that. I think that uh, the kind of prose that I write, calling poems, give me a whole lot greater range in the writing too of things that I can do. Uh, it's strange. In some ways, I guess, to talk about the permissions that prose fiction writers have that poets don't have. Uh, the biggest one seems to me, because of the naivete and of so many readers who want to read poetry as personal confession, or as personal expression. That's you talking. Uh,
yeah,
it's a figure that I've constructed and that I have a relationship with, maybe even a powerful, intimate relationship, but it's not me. Uh, it's a if at most, if you will, it's a version of me. Uh, uh, but those events didn't even happen to me. I was not Bloody Jack. Uh, but I write poems in his voice, or his out of his assumption. So when you have a named character, it happens less often. But
mhm,
uh, it's too bad, because a lot of my writing is rhetorical, of personae who speak and who hear and engage in dialogue or supplication or complaint or boasting or whatever with other figures, visible or named, invisible or named. Uh, I draw there heavily, as I'm sure you'll know this. I won't be surprised, at least, to hear this, on the work that Bakhtin did. He talked about dialogy, these multiple voices, and he was so good. He said, "Look at these figures. There's no one there physically present, supposedly, the character, but the character is constantly addressing and thinking of and anticipating an auditor or auditors." Uh,
yeah.
the and I learned a lot of this from Robert Croce, uh, particularly
Interesting.
uh, particularly a poem that a lot of people don't even know about, and I think it's one of his most brilliant texts, and that is the Sad Phoenician. Uh,
Mm,
the character there is constantly in complaint and boasting and supplication and excusing himself, uh, but he's constantly defined by
yeah,
other, uh, someone who's done him dirt, whatever. It's just a kind of comical barrage of these things, but also poignant parts. Uh, so that's been one of my models. He's been a big influence, so as you probably know,
of course.
uh,
Yeah,
as a writer, but as a friend as well.
I'm sure. Yeah, I
Yeah.
actually just finished rereading, I should say, the collection of the Stonehammer poems just this morning before we actually
Oh,
talked.
okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful collection. I return to it every once in a while. It's so great. But
I heard I heard when he launched the book. Well, he did in various places. He was on tour with the publisher
hmm,
and another poet. Uh, they came across traveling across Western Canada, and they arrived in Winnipeg. The student union at the University of Manitoba at that time were holding readings once every week. They had a new Canadian writer in to read and talk. And one day in comes this writer, and my friend David Arneson, who was also an enormous influence, said, "Cooley, are you going to the launch?" And I said, "I know oh, it's over in the studio. Let's go." And I said, "How do you pronounce his name?" "Kretsch," said David Arneson. He says, "Robert Kretsch." So I went to hear Robert Kretsch. But he was reading from the Stonehammer poems. And it was a great, wonderful reading, boisterous reading. So that's the first time I saw him, and I just instantly liked him.
Yeah, I guess my question in this case, the when I was talking about genre, I do like the idea of serial poems that you brought up by Bowering, and it just got me to think. Really, I agree with you that it's a bit hard sometimes to define certain things, or some. I know some writers just actively avoid it, which I can respect. But I do think there's something to acknowledge as well about how that changes the way that readers and even the writers themselves like think about the poem going into it or in writing it and engaging with it, rightly or not. I do think it does have an impact with the way we approach a poem, and just the fact that you mention it as a serial poem does at least impact or influence perhaps the way that I could think about this work going forward, right? As both something that's made up of many component parts, but that continues and progresses and engages with something in a serial manner over time, right? While still connecting to something previous. So I don't know. It's just something that I wanted to bring up, but I think your point in this case is well taken. Yeah.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. That
Right.
if we can't name something, we can't see it.
Mm.
That the notion that you look at things and you see them unimpeded, and then you can see them. It tends to work almost the exact opposite. I don't know what I'm looking at. I So how can I begin to understand it or place it or connect it or see it as aberration or whatever? So my comment was not from does not come from hostility toward naming, but they're saying I don't know quite how to name that one. That I mean, what's a poem? I don't think I could come up with an answer. The best I could do is say it's a relatively compressed and relatively intensified verbal document.
Mm.
Uh, uh,
Interesting.
within what happens to the graphic pieces is on. Okay, okay. Well, there's still poems if they have at least some semblance of letters in them. I don't know, but we're just
Photographs.
obviously
Mm.
what happens now. But uh, so for me as a writer, I say I'm writing poetry, but what I'm after is stuff that I think is energized and vital and fresh, has some oomph, and comes from things that I care about.
Moving forward in this case, you're someone, as you mentioned before, obviously you've with a friendship and engagement with you just mentioned Robert Croce and other writers, right? You've been engaged with Canlit as, I guess, a genre, if you want to call it that. I guess that's up for debate as well, right? Throughout, the past decades, in this case, at least since the 70s, as both a poet and a critic, right? And I'm wondering, right, as someone who's active from within, right, what we could broadly call Canlit, how do you see your work operating within these modern or contemporary currents of Canadian literature? And yeah, how has that changed over time, if at all?
I don't know what's happening in contemporary Canadian literature. That I've not been active as a critic now for some time, and when I open literary journals, there are 30 names I've never seen before. So who are these guys and what are they doing? So I sense that there's an explosion of new writers, uh,
Mm.
and I mean I see in the journals. I mean there's crazy Rob McLennan. Yeah, I don't know if you know him. He's a crazy man. He's this every day he's got 30 more poets that he's found, uh, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and bless him, he devotes his soul to finding them and celebrating them. I mean, his role is is just astonishing. I don't know how he does it. But if anybody that I know of who could say this is what seems to be happening, he's the guy. But uh, uh, it's kind of beyond my fathom what's happening right now.
In a more specific way, in this case, you've also been associated with prairie poetry specifically, right? And this is something we talked a little bit about before starting recording. But do you feel like this is accurate as a kind of identifier for you as a prairie poet? Because obviously that can have more meaning than just where you're from
Mm.
in this case. And do you, again, still see that as being relevant to your contemporary work?
I think so. That I I guess I would describe my writing over decades in ways that I actually used to describe Robert Croce. I wrote a book called The Home Place about Croce, and which I named him as Prairie Postmodern, which I'm sure would raise immediate obvious objections, which is it one or the other, but I think it is both. Some because you're making somewhat different appeals, aren't you, to some notion of locality, perhaps even authenticity of some kind or other, as opposed to some notion of a radical disarrangement or rearrangement of form and language in postmodernism. But I think that that's what Croce was on about, and what I think have been on about, so that um, that mind, for me at least, I would say that I think that both terms would apply, not probably not equally, and certainly not at any given time equally. I take on a project of a certain kind. When I wrote poems about my parents, they were scarcely postmodern. I mean, the one about my father perhaps a bit, but the one about my mother is in many ways a kind of lyrical poem, a lyrical meditative poem, and I wanted it in that way. I wasn't going to joke or go into gymnastics, linguistic or formal gymnastics. I wanted to write a poem that was quietly lamenting my mother's death and my father's death. But that one was more varied. But so the times when I'm doing some kind of writing, it's more lyrical. Sometimes it's more ribald. Sometimes it's more idiomatic. Sometimes it's a mix. So I think both terms would apply to what I'm doing or what I'm trying to do or think I'm doing. The prairie writing is, as your terms would imply, is not something matter of from, but of what poetry of the prairies, as in not only directionally, but as in or as on a map, but as in a sensibility or a kind of knowledge or care that round about. I started many years ago a book called 1931, based on the Eston miners' strike in 1931, and I got moved off into other things and haven't got back to it in what 30 years probably, and that's maybe one of the next ones I'm going to do, go back to it. But it's very rooted in the prairies, the Estevan, where I grew up.
It is interesting. I don't know if this was the intention in this particular case, but a lot of work from the prairies has engaged with the experience of being. And to bring it back to the topic at hand, in this case of your most recent work, the bodily sensations and felt sensations of the prairie. We keep coming back to Croce, but this has been true of novelists as well, right? Grove talked a lot about this in his work. Martha Estenso did so as well. These are older writers as well, but this kind of bodily feeling of the prairies is something that has come up in many writers as well. I'm making connections in this case to the larger topic. I don't know if that was your intention with this particular collection, but I do think it's a connection worth making.
Yeah. Well, if that term, that name means anything for literary purposes, the least interesting definition probably is prairie writing is writing that's written by people who live in the prairies, however briefly, but who've occupied the space. You can write Mallarmé out of Winnipeg. Does it make it a prairie text? It may not matter to some people much, but it does to me. And I have a strong respect for your sense of locale anywhere. I think if you don't care about locale, you're an imperialist. What matters is what I decide as I move through the world, my sense of importance, self-importance, or or significance, and you are of less interest by definition. So it's crucial, I think, for people all over the world to have local pride and to care about their worlds, and for their worlds to enter in ways that are honored and significant, and in whatever cultural activities they're involved in or confined. There's a respect for people to honor those things. How you do them, how well you do them, I guess, is a problem. So that some way or other, if you're going to be of that world, you've got to find some way of signifying some connectedness to the place. And history is one obvious example. In the prairies, the history is not very long for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
But you're the one who's done all this work on this topic.
Yeah, no, but I figured exactly because I'm currently trying to do some work on the topic, I would get at least the thoughts of someone who's so steeped in that literature and place and culture in this case. But yeah, that's I think a very insightful answer in this particular instance. And you've answered other questions that I've had throughout the discussion in this case. And I'm curious, before we kind of wrap this up, if you wanted to perhaps share one last poem or two that you might want to read.
Bone house, inside which we protect neither ghost nor spirit, which tear until the sun leaks marrow, tomorrow and to morrow time borrows. The hall warps the mirrors before which we move, and in which wrapped as if we were not there. Your sorrow bidden quickens, your ankles once bitten click like beads in prayer, castanets in the morning, when you run into a cascade of yellow, hardy as yarrow. Pests cannot kill, nor drought put an end to. You want to live as shadows shed, as a sparrow fishing for light, as near and as narrow.
Thank you very much. One question that I always like to ask, what didn't I ask in this interview? And what is the answer to that question?
What you didn't ask is, why do you do this in the first place? Or why do you continue to do this? The first phrasing make it sound like it's hostile a bit. Why do these kinds of things?
So what is the answer to that question?
I'm not sure that you can think of many reasons, and there, I think almost anyone you could think of would be probably good. You do this because uh, uh, you want to work out some things, maybe solve some problems or things that are nagging at you. You do this because you find some compensation or comfort in it. That almost any reason you can think of is probably credible. For me, I think mostly it's that it's almost a compulsion. It's but a pleasant compulsion. You just like to do it, kind of almost need to do it, saying, I get at this. I know it's like people who exercise, I guess, all the time. You got to go and do it because, it feels good. It feels right. So I do it because I have this strong desire to do it and find it gratifying in all kinds of ways, writing out of your passions and your cares. That I think probably for me, that as much as anything, coming into some expression, say, that one, I like that. That's something crazily satisfying.
And do you want to share anything that you're working on currently that listeners can perhaps look forward to?
Okay, brace yourself. Brace you. Okay.
All the notes.
Okay. Well, I got these stacks consist of material that is well developed, ready for selection for 2 books. Publishers are waiting for them. And on the bottom of it are a huge stack of notes for the same work. So 2 books are coming out of this, tentatively called Love on a Dry Land and Wind and Horses. And they're the latest from a long manuscript they're working on forever called Love on a Dry Land, from which 2 books have already come. So I've been working on this stuff since 1989. So that's what I'm most immediately working on. But I've needed probably about 2 weeks to get to make the selections and out of this and have them with the publishers. So here they are. And this is, I think I told you, this derives from St. Ross's As For Me in My House.
It makes sense. You didn't say
I,
it specifically, but yeah, that makes sense just based on the title in this case.
yeah. And I was kind of dismayed. For a stretch, you got people saying, well, this is just realism. It's kind of boring and predictable. Or something. No, it's filled with poetry that what are you talking about? So anyway, just been great fun doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for sharing what you're doing, sharing so much, so many readings in this case of your work. And we will definitely link to the book. Do you know when it comes out, or is it already out? Like I said,
Yeah, it physically exists. It's going to be physically launched on April the 22nd at Montgomery Robinson in Winnipeg. And then it's going to have a reading in Saskatoon on the 26th and a reading in Calgary on the 30th of April.
Fantastic. And we will definitely provide a link in the description of the show when we release this, where people can find the book.
Terrific. I'm very pleased, and the press is going to be very pleased that this is very special. You're doing this and doing this so intelligently and knowledgeably.